Before the body was even cold from the train wreck of a debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, one David Hogg went to Twitter to complain that his favorite topic, gun control, was not brought up. Now, in this episode, we are going to dig into some of the reasons that I am speculating why guns didn't come up, but also look at how this idea of the Hegelian dialectic is being used against you in specifically the way that we think about culture and what is right and true and good. And so before we do, I want to bring up the show's sponsor, which is Obsidian Arms. Now, Obsidian Arms is a manufacturing powerhouse out of Minnesota. And if you regularly go to the range, chances are there's something that they've made that you are using frequently. And so if you are looking for gunsmithing tools or gunsmithing tools that come with a lifetime warranty or specific parts like their firing pin for an AR-15, which has one feature that sets it out amongst many, you should go over to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. And if you're on the other side of that Borean wall that says, I'm trying to bring something to market, they have your back. If you're interested in taking a concept that you've designed and making it real, go ahead and check them out as well. Again, that is Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. They are this show's first sponsor. And back to the conversation. So, why didn't guns come up in the first presidential debate? This, again, is speculation, but my speculation might actually end up being correct. The first thing that comes to mind is that guns is a losing topic for both candidates. Why is it a losing topic? Well, for Joe Biden, it's pretty straightforward. About the only people he can talk to about his quote-unquote policies for gun control is his own base, who are already committed to voting for him. Whereas if you were to try to talk to moderates or anyone who might be in their undecided phase, if you were to stick to his normal rhetoric of not knowing what he's talking about or not using the right words or just referring to sort of 2015 era political talking points that were not only derailed but heavily debunked, showing that he didn't learn anything in the last 10 years, well, he's probably going to be off-putting to begin. But then for the issue, this also extends towards Donald Trump as well, because he lost the respect of many gun owners when he went along with the bump stock ban, which thankfully has been overturned. So for both candidates, the topic itself is sort of unpopular. For Donald Trump, it might hint to weakness in his track record, and to Joe Biden, it simply is. If you're we're gonna have to cut to that meme of if you don't vote for me, then you're not black kind of thing. It's extremely divisive for both of them. But I think this is more important to look at some of the other details that are going on. One, and this is bad for me, but good for you. And when I say bad for me, is it's not a great topic to market on, or it's not a gripping subject to catch your attention and drive you into interest, but it's that quietly and steadily we've seen the landscape of American law and politics go in favor of gun owners. Now, it's not universal and it's not absolute, but what we've seen is that we've seen not necessarily a strategy, but an issue leveling on the layer of philosophy and law, less on the possession of individual items. We've seen the bump stock ruling get overturned. We've seen the brace ruling get overturned. We've seen the ATF stripped of their ability, or at least the attention is put on them making laws via interpretations. And you've even seen recently the overturn of Chevron deference, which once again is another example of things that are good for us in the sense of good for the gun culture, but they do not carry the champion's banner weight that we might be looking for. In addition to that, I know Tim Pool brings it up, or used to bring it up often, even when we were on the show, but he talked about he talked about how gun control or the constitutional carry is expanding across the United States. I think we're at 29 states now, and I should fact check my own material before I get into recording, but whatever happens in this case happens. So what we're watching across the United States are quiet victories, gentle victories that have long-standing consequences, but they may not have the kind of political panache that we're looking for. In addition to that, there is a divisiveness in the United States where it seems like states are either going very far in support of an individual's right to defend themselves and the right to bear arms, or they're going against that in addition to something else. And so we need to look no further than Washington State, California, Minnesota, to see how that how these the differences between states is becoming greater, not lesser. Now, some of this might be attributed to a subject that did come up in the debate, particularly around the subject of abortion, which was that the Roe v. Wade being overturned meant that it was giving power back to the states, or the federal government was shedding of itself a certain level of power through the court systems and returning that responsibility to the states themselves. And so these might be two different ways of saying the same thing, but we're seeing that division change broadly in guns as well. And so having lived in a state with constitutional carry and a state without it, it is actually quite a drastic difference when you look at the attitudes that it has on the people who live there. Now, we might want to say that just the law itself isn't that much of a burden, but I warn you, and I might want to present a subject that goes oftentimes not unnoticed, but unstated, and that is the second and third order effects of said laws. Now, if your state and the state that you live in requires you to have a certain level of, let's say, bona fides to carry a firearm, one, we already know certain things like it's not going to stop certain people from owning them, but it also has no meaningful impact on the people who are, let's just say, using these tools for the intent of malicious activity. Rather, it appears to look a lot more like protecting a certain political class through the means of surveillance and credentialism. But if we are going to move away from that subject, if we're going to move away from the divisiveness of such things, I also want to cover what and how our culture has been approaching this idea of gun control for at least the past 40 years. Certainly all of my life, and then I believe it's safe to assume some time before that. And that is that the country is sliding in one direction and it is constantly lurching to the left, which in this subject would be in support of gun control or in opposition to the Second Amendment. Now, if you look back through history, at least the last 100 and something odd years, you can definitely see how that has, in a sense, been the case. You had things like the Gun Control Act or the National Firearms Act. You had things that happened under Reagan and things that happened well before then. You had this kind of hemming and hawing change early. You had the 1994 assault weapons ban. You had all of these different things that kind of moved the needle away from the rights of the individual and more to the protection of the state. And this has to apply, or this needs to be brought up in the subject of Hegel. Now, if you've listened to a decent amount of if you've listened to a decent amount of James Lindsay, you will probably be somewhat familiar with this, but I want to break down the simplicity of the Hegelian dialectic and how you might be the victim of a cultural psyop that's much bigger. This idea of the Hegelian dialectic is that there's a thesis, a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. In other words, you have a norm, you have something that challenges the norm, and then they come together to create the new norm. This is an extremely simplified version of it. And in the idea of gun control, one thing that you will hear people talk about is, why is there no compromise? And of course, if my compromise is between suicide and what I'm currently doing now, it's not really a compromise. If I have to choose between, let's see, here's another example. If you point a gun at me and say, give me your money, and I say no, and then you respond with, okay, let's compromise, then that's not really a compromise. It's more of an appeasement. If one man is holding another person at gunpoint and says, I'm going to kill you for whatever reason, and then the person being threatened responds to, no, let's compromise, it's not really a compromise between two different opinions in a meaningful way. It's more like, well, what we described, highway robbery. And so this issue and I want to talk about this in framing because I think that we've been hoodwinked. Now, there is certain literature that you can read among certain peoples, including those of Hegel, or you can even go into like the cultural Marxists, and you can move on from there. Or even the way that we've seen this idea of the Overton window being shifted. We can look out and say, well, you know what? There are people who want to change our culture, and they're doing it by the big ask, or they're doing it by making a change and then expecting everybody to catch up. Now, what that might look like in this case is we're going to go for an assault weapons ban, and you say no, and then I say let's compromise, and you say no. Any compromise is between something that isn't. It's a compromise between a 0 and a -1, or a 0 and a 1. It's not really a compromise because it's still moving in some direction. And this is a problem that particularly the Second Amendment advocates have had for some time, is that our only desire, at least our only political desire, it seems, is to be left alone. And while that sounds fantastic from a libertarian point of view as the eudaimonia, or the great achievement, what it doesn't do well, and it doesn't do well at all, is argue for something. It's just simply leave me alone. And so if we wanted to maintain the status quo of the current attitude of firearms ownership in the United States, would we be moving in a direction that is positive or negative? Well, we wouldn't be moving at all, and we would be stuck in our certain situations. And so why the left has seemed to have an advantage is, and let's not just the left, but we'll talk about gun control advocates. What they have as an advantage is they have a spoon-fed, ready-made direction. They want to change things. And in order to change the status quo, all you need do is pick a direction and aim at it. Now, if the right, or whatever the idea of gun ownership, doesn't want the status quo to change, then they have to hold their ground. But if you remember movies like Lord of the Rings, one did not defeat the Dark Lord by winning the battle at Helm's Deep. They simply survived it and then were able to counterattack. And in our culture, if we were to try to address it in that way, we would not be making any direction, any headway, or any victory, nor would we be benefiting from the encouragement of said victories if we simply remained staying still as our goal, that we don't want the laws to change, or that we want them to change in our favor, but we're not really articulating what that looks like. The problem solution or the problem solution result method, this idea, this very simple argument of, well, we have a problem with gun violence. State that there's a problem. Is there a problem? Now we have to debate that. But state that there's a problem, state that you have a solution, and then advocate for that solution has worked really, really well in support of gun control, but it has hoodwinked even the right into believing that it's constantly moving in one direction. So, if you're familiar with the literature that has been written about it, talked about it, complained about it on the internet, about how, well, the gun control debate only moves in one direction, the answer is yes, but actually no. Yes, in the sense that it's always being brought up by adversaries, or most often being brought up by adversaries. And if we look back over the last 15 years, it seems like every couple of years there's a cascading event which brings up the topic again that everyone's got to talk about, and then the gun control advocates bring up a bunch of ideas. They all turn out to be stupid. They all get smacked down, and then nothing changes. Well, one, nothing changes because your ideas are bad, and two, nothing should change in your direction because your ideas very likely are also evil. But if I want to throw stones don't live in glass houses? Oops. So moving on to tighten this up. While the cultural perspective or perception of, let's say, guns has, in a sense, been assumed as being moving in one direction, we've actually seen differences. we've seen different things going on. We've seen these things like constitutional carry. We've seen these things like um, people functioning in, or people defending the right to bear arms even in public positions of authority or responsibility. We've seen this happen time and time again where courts will overrule or overturn things that are being wielded against people in this way. And what does this bring up? What does this point out? I want to bring attention to the idea of how a city's legal system works. And I'm not presenting this as a lawyer or as an expert, but one of the reasons why, and I think one of the things that will affect us more, that has to do with why guns weren't brought up as much in or at all in the most recent presidential debate, is because the most effect that you're going to have, that your vote is going to have, is not on the president, but on your local on your local elected positions. This might be things like DAs. This might be things like a sheriff. This might be things like a mayor or a governor. But your decisions there are going to have a much greater impact on your life than simply what the president is, or than the president in a certain sense. Now, why am I making this assertion, and what do I think that, or why am I making this assertion? What is my credentials or my criteria for this assessment? It goes something like this. The efforts that the Biden presidency and the Obama presidency attempted to put in place when it came to guns not only made them deeply unpopular, but pretty much ground their presidencies to a halt. You saw this in 2013, where you had the aftermath of the Sandy Hook shooting, and the language and the rhetoric on all of this firearms prohibition and almost like, not Orwellian, but this sort of move to tighten the hatch grew so much opposition to the Biden or the Obama presidency that when there was a midterm soon after, it didn't go their way. Put it gently, it didn't go in the way of the Obamas. Now, that it turned it, in a sense, into somewhat of a lame duck presidency. And I don't think that the people who are playing the game of politics are so short-sighted as to not recognize this fact. The other thing, though, that has a lot more to do with it is that you want to look at who are making the prosecutions and who are attending to the types of crimes that are used as an examples against you, that even if those crimes are not overtly affecting your life, as in they're not in your backyard, and they are affecting your life, but I'm not trying to belittle it here, but who are prosecuting or not prosecuting those crimes, that might be more of it, might have a greater impact on our long-term future than what we're dealing with today. So, or then just what the president has to say. And so, in a sense, and what I'm trying to say by this is that we are in a stage, I think we're observing enough of decentralization on the national level that you're seeing states either being constitutional carry or assault weapons ban. You're either in one that believes that individuals have a right to bear arms, or you're in a state that is functioning under the auspices that it is the responsibility of bureaucrats to determine whether you can defend yourself and to what capacity and how well. So in that case, in that state, in that sense, we are looking at solutions that are much closer to home, and that is being aware of who we have influence over. So to close it down, to finish this off with a very perhaps unexpected spin or unexpected segue, is the topic of deepfakes and how we perceive reality. Now, one of the issues that we're seeing with AI, this thing that is being called AI, this generative learning capable technology and whatever, and the ability to create fake videos of people mimicking their voice to say certain things. What I mean by this is our computing capabilities when it comes to creating media is so powerful that it seems like it's right on the cusp of challenging whether or not we can trust even what we see on the screen. Now let's make the leap in the assumption, and let's go all the way to the end and say that within a year or within the next 6 months or tomorrow we wake up and there's a free app on your phone where you can use to make any person you want, a video of any person you want doing anything you want. In other words, we have this convincing generative tool to create fake content about things. So you'll see, make you see someone goes, make a video of me having a sub quarter second draw time with a Glock 19 from concealment and hit an 800 a target at 100 yards, an 8-inch target at 100 yards. Like, and so the computer like burp it, and it makes it into a real format for something like Instagram. If that were possible tomorrow, how would we verify what is true? Well, we'd have to come back to verifying things closer to home. That might mean there's more disagreement on the broader scale, just like we're observing within this concept of gun rights versus assault weapons bans, that if that which is closer to home, we are more closer to where we live, we are more capable of verifying. If the deepfake concept were to be made possible and universally distributed tomorrow, then you would see not only an increase in the distrust of media in general, but probably a change in the way that it's used, and it might produce that so-called decentralized renaissance that many of us claim to be waiting for. Now, how does this apply to the gun control conversation? How does this apply to the world that we're living in? Well, one, the statistics that are given about the use of weapons in crimes it doesn't seem to be very convincing one way or another. It doesn't seem to be convincing one way or another with whether or not it is or isn't used. Whether or not it leads to some sort of moral responsibility of the government to act in a certain way, or to restrict or limit or so long and so forth. Rather, it seems like the events that are immediately in our areas of, living, I was going to use AO, areas of operation, but in our neighborhoods, in our communities, and our preconceived political views that have more of an impact on whether or not we think individuals should have the right to bear arms. Now, what does that mean for the presidential election? If either president wants to create only a problem with no great advantage for either presidential candidate, if either presidential candidate intends to derail their campaign, then the only thing they should ever do is talk about guns. And yet it's one of those subjects that is important to us, that we find sensitive and we find compelling. So we are in a bit of a conundrum. If a candidate talks about the subject too much, they will derail their campaign. But it's still a subject that we're very interested in. You know who that will have more of an effect on? Your local elections. So with that being said, we're going to close this episode up, and we are going to get ready for what is coming throughout the rest of this week. We've got some analysts coming on the show. It is the 4th of July week, if you are listening concurrently. And we will have an event in Utah on the 6th of July, 2024, including a cleanup of public land. So if you want to join us, you can go over to redactedllc.com/events and find the information there, or on any future cleanups or events that we will be hosting. That being the case, if you want to support the show, if you want to jump in on some of the things that or if you want to pick up some of our patches and shirts and things that keep the lights on, you can head over to redactedllc.com or redactedculture.locals.com. And in closing, make sure you check out Obsidian Arms, because they have been kind enough to sponsor us, and they have some fantastic products that you might want to get before they're harder to obtain, if that ever becomes the case. Yeah, that is what it is. So, in conclusion, thank you for listening. Now go forth and conquer.